Well, thank you all for coming back from your breaks and all those things. I see we've got a couple of new faces as well. Welcome. We're going to shift our conversation, the focus of our conversation now to the CHIPS and Science Act. And helping us lead that conversation today is James Brown from the STEM Ed Coalition. And we also have two ecosystem leaders who were pivotal in some of the behind the scenes work of making this happen, Martha McCabe and Jeremy Babinger. But before we do any of that, we have Jan Morrison joining us by phone on her way out of town for vacation with her family to offer a general overview of this truly momentous moment. Jan?
Thanks, Jeremy, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I
We've
want
gotcha.
to take us all back to 2021, to where in 2021, hundreds of stakeholders, STEM stakeholders, many of you, came together to put together a series of town hall meetings. Do you remember we did that? And it was in the dead of winter to identify the top STEM needs for our country. We compiled a report about those findings and shared them with all of our friends, with the federal, state, local leaders, with any kind of influencer we could find who wanted to hear and was eager to hear all of our voices. We're happy to be here today as we begin to shape how we're now able to respond to those needs and to those priorities. We have hung in there, not just in the time of COVID, but in understanding that perseverance is so important when you know that infrastructure that we have created together is the way to shape our nation. That town hall report, to refresh your memory, is on the STEM ecosystem website. It's being dropped in the chat now, so you have it and easily accessible. I'd like to also have you take a moment to congratulate yourselves for the amazing work that you've done over the years in helping to gain attention to this. I think we can't overstate that. We speak as if we have been a community for a couple of decades, and the reality is it's not a decade even. And when when we come together, as Reginald loves to say, there is a power of the collective. And the brilliance of that is how we forge the future together. I want to also be absolutely sure that we thank a few people, right? When we talk about town halls, when we talk about reports, when we talk about writing and communication, we are also speaking very straightly about Lissa Briggs and her communications team. And all too often, that communications team is in the background, and you hear Jeremy's voice, but it takes hours and hours of thinking, writing, creating, and connecting to you all to make that work. And when we're speaking about policy legislation and moving our nation to the vision and actually executing on that, we are always talking about James Brown and the STEM Ed Coalition. We need to stop for a moment and congratulate James and the STEM Ed Coalition. We have a terrific partnership with them, and we're all so grateful to you. So Jeremy, thanks so much for the opportunity to take this moment. Even though I'm on vacation, I wouldn't want to have missed it. It is a moment in time for all of us, and I speak about that so often. And yet it is true that we have managed together to make this moment for all of our children, their families, and our communities that we all represent.
Well, thank you, Jan. And next, I'm going to ask James to give us an overview of the CHIPS and Science Act and to explain exactly how STEM ecosystems are included in that language and what it means. As James is speaking and his questions occur to you, make sure you're keeping those noted. You can put them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and get as many of those questions answered as possible. We've got a big hunk of time at the end for James and for other experts to answer those questions. And we're really excited to learn more, and we're so excited to see what all of you are able to do with this funding. James?
Well, hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to talk about something that actually happened that was positive in Congress this week. It's not every week of the year we get to do that. And this is, really exciting to see where we go with what's happened in Congress. So let me just explain sort of the broad outlines of what Congress has passed. So last week, the House and Senate agreed and voted on a piece of legislation called the CHIPS and Science Act. The core of this bill is an investment of a little more than $50 billion, starting like literally right now, in semiconductor manufacturing capabilities across the country. You've heard about some of these deals. Intel has announced interest in Ohio. There are semiconductor deals coming together in Indiana and California and New York and Arizona, other places. That's the core aspect of the bill. That's the CHIPS part of the bill. And coupled with that is a massive expansion of the National Science Foundation's mission as it relates to technology development and the deployment of innovations created in the United States at a more commercial scale. And one of the big themes for NSF's involvement was a scaling up of its efforts both to support STEM education through research grants as its traditional mission, which is sort of individual investigator-led research grants on what works and what doesn't. But more importantly, one of the big elements in this bill is the notion that NSF will be scaling up the centers and large research grants and awards to help disseminate best practices and really to help the adoption of things that NSF has discovered work and do them at a larger scale. And so that's where the STEM ecosystems fit into this. To be specific, what the bill does is take what we had developed with Senator Kelly and Senator Moran and others, the STEM Ecosystems Act, that we've briefed this group about several times. It includes the definition of STEM ecosystems, which is basically our definition. It actually makes reference to the White House report in 2018 as the starting point for this conversation. And that's something that I know, a lot of the folks on this call were involved in. And then it makes STEM ecosystems eligible for a new grant program called the Pre-K-12 STEM Education Grants Program for Innovation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the elements of that program are. But before we go any further, to Jan's point, there are lots of groups that had a hand in making this work. Obviously, a big shout out to Senator Kelly of Arizona, Senator Moran of Kansas, to the people from Arizona and Kansas that really played a big role in motivating them to care about this. But the network of organizations that help get this across the finish line is really broad, and that's what's always necessary to get something like this done. So the STEM Education Coalition members really were enthusiastic about this bill. You had companies like Qualcomm and Microsoft and Apple that were really interested in this concept, that talked about this with their members. Battelle and the STEMX network were really instrumentally involved in this because there's so many other coalitions and state level organizations that participate and that with a little e see themselves as part of the STEM ecosystems world. That was really important in terms of crafting a definition that wasn't just specific to the so-called ecosystems that we all identify with here, but broadly inclusive of all the new forms of organizations that call themselves STEM ecosystems, whether they're regional or state or local. It was important to recognize that concept as being a really broad concept. So that's there's lots of folks to think about this. Ultimately, this deal came together because the House Science Committee staff thought we had a really good idea behind the STEM ecosystems concept. They were the ones who wrote the final draft of this bill, and all those groups I just mentioned were really important in convincing them this was an idea that was sufficiently well developed to see spending some money on. And so that's how we got to where we are. What the opportunity is, and this is pieces of legislation like this happen, and then the National Science Foundation does something with it, right? So what it tells NSF to do is to create a grant program that would support centers of innovation around K-12 STEM education practices that are intended to what's the best way to use this, to help scale up what's working. So imagine that NSF over the course of the next several years would fund perhaps a dozen or 24 of these centers for STEM education. So you might have one focused on, for example, diversity in the STEM fields. You might have one focused on regional and local capacity in STEM fields. And that's where I think the ecosystems would really fit in nicely. You could envision other sort of topics of interest within the realm of STEM education where NSF would look at the body of research that's out there and say, we need to have a national center or a regional center to explore this or that aspect of STEM education, meaning that the purpose of these centers wouldn't be to do research into STEM education topics. It would be to propagate what's already working at a larger scale. So that was the key concept that was incorporated into this grant program. And, one of the things I think would be smart for the ecosystems community to do is to digest the specific elements of this program, figure out where the individual capabilities of both individual organizations and the collective, the community of practice, where we're strong, where we're weak in terms of looking at the requirements for applying for one of these centers. And it's, it hinges on things like partnerships with higher education and partnerships with school districts and your capacity to show you have an evidence base for the types of programs that you're supporting and that you think they would work at a larger scale. All of that is wrapped into the bill language. And what's going to happen is over the course of the next several months, NSF has the option of funding this new program through its existing mix of programs or creating something new. And at the end of the year, the Congress is going to go through an exercise to decide how much additional money would be appropriated to the NSF to fund these programs. And one of the sort of implicit deals behind this whole bill is that while the semiconductor industry got roughly $50 billion that's going out the door today, there is a agreement amongst the sponsors of this bill on both sides of the aisle that something like $5 or $10 billion in additional funding to support the other aspects of this bill that are not yet funded would be included in an end of the year spending deal to support, all of the other panoply of programs and provisions that are in there. So one of the things that's on us is, before we get to a chance to put together a proposal to submit to NSF, we need to show that there's lots of interest in our community. We need to think about where the areas of strength are in terms of meeting the requirements of this new grant program. And we need to communicate that to all the different stakeholders that are now developing this. Somebody in NSF has the job now of implementing this law that Joe Biden is going to sign into law next Tuesday in the Rose Garden. And after that, it'll be up to us to sort of, cultivate interest and produce a series of good proposals from this community. And at the same time, encourage NSF to do the right kinds of things in setting it up. So that's the opportunity that's in front of us. I would be, my sort of over-under prediction is that by sometime in the middle of next year, there will be an open competition for grants that fit this category. So that's what we've got to get ready for. And I think the key policy thing on the table here is this notion of now finally the National Science Foundation will be putting resources into scaling up educational initiatives rather than just developing and researching them. And that is an important development in the policy world around STEM education. So let me pause there, and we've got plenty of time for questions and comments and can talk about this, and I'll get caught up on the chat.
James, I really appreciate it. As always, you always have such great insights. And I know, you just mentioned that this funding will potentially, in your expectation, be available middle of next year, which seems far away. But we all know if we've worked on grants, particularly federal grants, there's a lot of work to do now to prep into that. So I'd like to dig into that in just a little bit. And we're also going to hear in just a moment from Jeremy and Martha about some of their thoughts. But before we go to Jeremy and Martha, I want to talk a little bit about some questions I've seen in the chat around the centers kind of as a whole. So first of all, how do you see the centers working with the SLECoP, with the community of practice?
Well, so, we don't know, right? NSF will establish those rules as they lay out the specifics of a program. But what the legislation tells them to do is that they should look at projects NSF has funded before. They should look at the capacity of local and regional organizations to scale up effective practices. So I'll just use FIRST Robotics as an example, right? If we were only talking about FIRST Robotics here and how NSF could scale up FIRST Robotics, or robotics would be how NSF would look at it. They look at an area and say, okay, how do we have any examples of successful robotics programs in an area? What did it take to fund those programs, and what's the capacity to maybe bring a robotics program to every school in a state or a district or a region, right? That's the kind of question that you would look at, except for this purpose, it's all of STEM. So it's not just robotics. It could be all of the regional capacity building in STEM. Could be one center grant for the whole United States. And it could be, housed within an existing organization. It could be on a university campus. It could be in a research organization. But the purpose of that grant would be to fund, and we're talking about something in the range of several $1 million. and 5-year grant would be to scale up regional and local capacity to operate STEM programs. That's kind of what it would look like.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And as we're thinking about these centers and we're thinking about the community of practice, I saw in the act that it mentions kind of 10 topic areas, 10 buckets that are being funded. Do you know anything about how they arrived at those 10?
So that's a product of sort of stakeholder input in the development of this bill, right? Those are the things that the different STEM advocacy groups went to the Capitol Hill staffers and members and said, these are the kinds of things that these centers should fund. So it's very much a product of, the community. It wasn't NSF deciding those things. Those were things that the members of Congress had heard about, and had decided were important features of a strong scaling up agenda for the National Science Foundation. In other words, those are the things that were sufficiently far along as concepts where they thought, additional resources would help more students gain access to those type of services.
And I see some folks in the chat asking exactly what those 10 are. One of our folks will dig up a link and put that in the chat, or James might be able to chat with you a little bit when he takes a break here in just a second.
Yeah, I was scanning through this 1,200-page bill while you were introducing me here, and I couldn't
Just
quite find the right section because they changed all the page numbers. So I'm going to rely on somebody else to find section 1,331 and post it in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, James. And I've got one more centers question before we sort of move on. And that's, that it always comes down to the money, right? And Jeremy Babender, our longtime friend and colleague in a big part of this work, is wondering if you have any sense yet of how the funding is going to be divided. In other words, how much is reasonable for a center to kind of go for to expand their work?
Well, so the reason why they're called centers or innovation centers in NSF parlance is because the National Science Foundation does do something like this in other areas of technology. So there are national nanotechnology centers. There are some centers in cybersecurity and cyber technology. NSF, if you look around NSF, they've funded other centers of innovation in other fields. And so what they're generally focused on is something where you have, either a community that's coalesced around a particular brand, like in nanotechnology, for example. They've decided on what the different branches of nanotechnology that need support are and which university programs are managing them. And that's what they've focused on scaling up, right? So can we have a program in another university that mimics one that's successful somewhere else, right? So that's their general model. So there's a lot of evidence for us to look at as how NSF has funded this before. But one of the big questions here is whether NSF will create a new program to support these innovation centers within what's the Education and Human Resources Directorate at the National Science Foundation. That's what fund these. They could also do it. Some people on the call are probably familiar with the NSF Includes program, and they could also do it as a series of grant awards underneath the NSF Includes program. So, the how of how they do it and how the solicitation comes out, those are all questions that are down the road. And, to your point about timing, one of the issues here is, we could perhaps, one way to look at this would be, wake me up when the solicitation drops, right? That's how a lot of people look at federal funding. But to your point, one of the things I think we really need to think about both within the ecosystems and what I'm telling other stakeholders in STEM is, take this thing seriously, figure out what your proposal would look like on principle, a long time in advance, and let's make sure let's do what we can to make sure NSF sets up a program that's designed to support those type of activities in practice, right? Like I don't want to leave this, to the winds of how a federal agency works and how Congress works to, let others decide this. We need as a community to be vocal about what we think we'd like to see them do in setting up this program.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And that the TIES, as the backbone organization of the STEM learning ecosystems community of practice, has been digging really heavily into this with you and internally. And as such, we have an RFI that we've put together. And Lauren, I think, is going to put that in the chat now. keep it in mind. Go ahead and open that link, save it. This isn't a commitment by any stretch on your part. This is just a request for information, and it's going to give ties the opportunity to identify and facilitate those who are interested in participating in this funding opportunity. Because what we know is the more collaborative efforts that we have, the more interstate efforts that we have, the larger the organizations that we're bringing together, and therefore the larger the impact that we can expect to bring, the more likely it is that we might be able to seek that funding. So go ahead and open up that link. If you are thinking about going into an effort around this work, make sure that that's something that you complete. Hang on to it, share it with your friends, all of those things. All right, James, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to rest your voice and all of those things. And I'd like to invite Martha McCabe and Jeremy Babender to share a few comments. Martha, Jeremy?
Jeremy, I'll defer to you first.
So just, we're excited that we got to be part of the conversation. I think, initially, there was interest to create a specific bill by Senator Kelly for STEM ecosystems. And the challenge was it was only, it was a Democrat, was really having trouble getting Republicans on board. And so the thing that was really powerful about our ecosystem is that we were able to reach out and just grassroots to all the ecosystems who had, starting off, who had Republicans. And what was impressive was so many were willing to reach out and see if they were willing to talk to their representatives and see if we could get anybody interested in that. And I think that really shows the power. So Martha will talk in a bit, and she was able to get her senator to really take interest in this. And that really showed how we were able to garner interest at the grassroots level to make it happen. How it ended up evolving is I think that's probably part of politics, as originally there was a specific bill for STEM ecosystems, and now it's been sucked into NSF, which I think could be a blessing and a curse. I think the part looking from the positive side is that originally they were looking for 25 million for the entire ecosystem network. And in my opinion, that's really a small amount of money. And so I think a possibility might be, as long-term, this might be able to garner more funding long-term for us as an ecosystem community. But I do like that TIES is really able and interested to help champion what is the best proposal that we might do. As that, I think in this time, it's really important that we are very clear what we are as STEM ecosystems, what we do. As a lot of you might have observed, that STEM ecosystem, a lot of people are just starting to use the word. And now that it's defined in the legislation, everybody's probably going to start using it as a buzzword. And so I think it's really important that we get out there, that we work collaboratively and create more opportunities, that people really get to know the difference of what a true STEM ecosystem is and what we mean by that, as opposed to putting it on to help make an application better. And so really appreciate just everybody's support coming to the convenings, really the openness of collaborating. And I just hope this continues to be an opportunity for us to connect and keep it going. So with that, pass it over to Martha.
Thanks, Jeremy. And, one of the interesting things when the call went out to those of us who have Republican senators was the opportunity to think about the longstanding relationships you do or don't have with your current legislators. And one of the things that I recognized is that I'm sorry, I'm babysitting a German Shepherd who's decided to talk at the same time. And I'm going to slide out onto the deck real quick. Many times, those of us that serve in this role as ecosystem leads, we get opportunities to travel, or we did, and hopefully those will return. You get the opportunities to travel with different organizations to talk to your legislators. So whether that's the National After School Alliance, whether it's the area health education centers, the AHECs, whether it's even traveling with Red Cross or American Heart Association, the more FaceTime you can have with your legislators so that they recognize your name, they know the work that you're doing. I think that's what made my easy email to Jake Vance, who was the legislative aide at the time working on education. He was familiar with my name and the Casey STEM Alliance, and not because I'd been on the Hill with ecosystems or with Casey STEM, but it was with all the other entities from a cross-sector partnership that allowed that to happen. And so if I was sitting here thinking, what advice might I give to our fellow compatriots, it's getting that face time, and whether it's, on the Hill or it's when they're back in your district, providing opportunities for them to come and see your work, to see, the folks that you are connecting with, and to students. I think that's where the value is, because it was a pretty simple ask. I think the other thing that, when Jeremy talks about us not being so excited it got pushed over into NSF, to be clear, Senator Moran chairs the Appropriations Committee for NSF. So he had a very specific interest in it going over into the NSF, and we'll see how that plays out. I think the other piece that I was really excited about is that I talked pretty directly with Senator Moran's office to understand that our post-secondary partners, while they're a very important part of our ecosystem, they aren't the only ones who can manage money and can manage grants. And so recognizing that there are other independent entities outside of a post-secondary institution who could be a very good grantee, because that will be a little bit different for NSF and this particular proposal. So those were kind of a few of my high points I wanted to share.
Well, Jeremy, Martha, I really appreciate not only you speaking to us today, but all of the incredibly deep work that you did to make a lot of this happen. I know, Jeremy, that you're a little bummed it's not specifically ecosystems. Try not to focus on that. This is a really, really incredible outcome. And we're going to be able to do a lot of good around this country based on this work. So Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
And it's a start that the name STEM, like the huge win also is that STEM ecosystems is recognized in that legislation. They could have done something else, Absolutely. But they put that in there.
100%. All right. Before we go to your questions that have been in the chat in general, I've got a couple that are on the RFI that I want to run through really quickly in case you're not paying attention to the chat, because some of you aren't. I don't always. The first is Dale mentions to confirm those of us with relevant overlapping efforts can complete this and potentially be involved in reference to the RFI. And Alyssa said yes. I think the key here is that being part of a STEM ecosystem, while not a requirement, is a huge leg up. But number one, there's a very good chance, if you don't know already, that you might actually be within the geographic bounds of an existing ecosystem. So by completing that RFI, we can help put you in touch with those folks. There's also always the possibility, with enough interest, that more ecosystems could be created and spun up. And that's also a thing that we can help you with. So yes, if you're not sure that you live in an ecosystem, absolutely still go ahead and complete that effort. There will also be some national, potentially some national applications that those might fit under. Caitlin, I think, was asking when this needs to be completed, and Xan mentioned that the deadline is September 4th, but we're really hoping it's earlier than that, the end of August, ideally at the latest. And keep in mind, this is just showing your interest. It's no level of commitment or legal commitment by any stretch of the imagination. So talk to your folks, see if this is a fit, if this funding source you think would be a fit. Go ahead and fill it out. You always could drop out if you absolutely need to. And finally, somebody direct messaged me and asked, does everyone fill out this form? And what I would say is everyone, in the sense that we want all comers, but if you have multiple people from an organization here, what I would ask is that you talk together in your organization. Again, make sure it's a fit, and just have one member of that organization go ahead and complete it, just so we can keep it unmuddled. All right, now I'd like to go to some of the other questions that have been filtering in. And first, James, I'd like to talk a little bit about who is eligible for this funding. We talked about the ecosystems and that importance, but Marcella Klein-Williams asks, community colleges aren't research institutions, and they're not PK-12, and they're not an ecosystem. Are they identified in this funding at all, community colleges?
Not in this particular one, because the focus is on K-12 STEM. I mean, that's the direct answer.
And I'm going to add on to that direct answer and say that really is the power of participating in an ecosystem. If you're new to this initiative, bear with me, those of you who aren't. I'm going to give the 45-second long definition. There's a much, much longer. But ecosystems bring together a whole bunch of people, sort of typically pre-K through 12 schools, with a little bit of a focus on the publics, but not exclusionary to the privates, the parochials, the charters. Higher education, including community colleges, business and industry, funders and foundation, and out of school time folks to think about a region. Sometimes that region's a full state, sometimes it's a micro region. It depends on the ecosystem. To think about the needs of a region as it relates to STEM education, job pipelines, and get those folks to work together to build their human capital and their funding, pool those resources to really attack those issues. So this is a kind of a great commercial, frankly, accidentally, for community colleges and why they should be involved. Community colleges are some of the best partners we have in STEM ecosystems. And while community colleges aren't specifically cited, by being part of an ecosystem, you still might be able to, depending on how that ecosystem writes a funding proposal, you still might be able to access some of that money, because we are very, very deep believers in the importance and the power of community colleges. All right, James, let's talk about actually, you know what, let me circle back and still talking a little bit about the who's eligible. You talked about PK-12. Does that imply formal education only, or does that include out of school time and informal education?
Well, so this is a great, I found the bill language. Some of this can be answered by just reading the wise words of our Congress, right? So it's worth, let me read the definition that's in the statute for STEM ecosystem, because I think this speaks to a lot of this, right? So STEM ecosystem, the term STEM ecosystem, and again, with a lowercase e, right? They're trying to be inclusive, means a local, regional, or statewide network, consortium, or multi-sector partnership, which may be led or co-led by a nonprofit educational organizational entity that is operating in the United States with the goal of supporting participation in STEM study, activities, and career pathways, as defined in the Co-STEM Annual Progress Report of 2020. That's the one that Jan was referencing a little bit earlier. And when they lay out the eligibility for this program, which, by the way, I put the wrong page in the chat up there. The program actually starts on page 592. If you look in the section that I posted online, it says eligibility for this grant program. The entity seeking an award for a center under this section must be an institution of higher education, a nonprofit organization, or a consortium of such institutions, which may include a STEM ecosystem, meaning the definition I just read. So it is a little broader than I just intimated earlier, but the focus is on K-12.
Perfect. Thank you, James. One more question just about the kind of the bill in general. And this question was, will any of the other funds that are part of this federal law that STEM has access to? I thought the whole bill was touted as costing $280 billion. What's the other $230 billion being used for? And is that something that we need to kind of keep in mind as we're moving forward?
So when you're talking about, one of the challenges we have in Washington is with scale and numbers, right? So you're right, the bill authorizes a total of $280 billion in spending. But it helps to understand the different colors of money and what NSF and the Congress means. So when I talked about the semiconductor funds, the $50 billion, it's $52.5 billion for semiconductor manufacturing. That was included as an emergency appropriation, meaning money available tomorrow to the Department of Commerce to support semiconductor manufacturing. All of the other amounts in this bill are all authorized amounts, meaning Congress can spend that amount or less on all the other functions that are included in the bill. So one of the big proposals there was to massively expand funding for the National Science Foundation and the creation of a new technology directorate. I believe that is a multi-year authorization that totals roughly $200 billion over the next 5 years, are authorized for that function in NSF. However, it's up to Congress to decide how much to actually spend. So that was the reference I made at the end of the year of there's an understanding amongst the authors of this bill that they're going to seek an additional perhaps $5 to $10 billion above current spending levels to support some of these programs in the next year. that will be sprinkled across various different NSF fund functions. And one of the reasons why this is complicated is that all those numbers I just cited, they all include the current funding level for NSF. So it's not all new money. It's authorizing that NSF could spend up to that amount over the next several years. And of course, NSF is currently spending roughly $10 billion a year already. So the budget math is never easy to explain in clear terms.
I think that I don't think I've ever seen anything come out of the federal government that was easy to explain in clear terms. That's why we're lucky to have you, James. I don't know about the rest of you, but I see a 1,100-page document and I get dizzy inside. James seems to get excited and bust out his highlighters and has most of the thing memorized by the end of the week. All right, so here's where my mind is as for those of you who don't know, I do this work with the national initiative, but I'm also part of an ecosystem here in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm trying to think about, what's next and what we should be doing to prepare. And I'm hoping, Alyssa, Jan, that you might be able to talk to us a little bit about what we at either as members of existing ecosystems or as folks who aren't part of an ecosystem but want to be involved, what we should be doing to prepare to hit the ground running for when the full solicitations happen. Jan or Alyssa?
Okay, Jan just texted Alyssa. Okay, so I'll start, and I'm sorry that I'm off camera for 1 second. What the first step is to put as much information in that RFI as you can. And because the chat is pretty heavily populated, Lauren, could you please drop it in again? That would be great, if you don't mind. Second, we are going to be working very closely with James over the next few weeks to take a look at, your ideas that are brought forward, your needs, who you're serving, and so forth, and making some matches and doing some stuff with that information. James, do you want to add in a little bit there about some of the conversation that we had the other day?
Well, I think what we're trying to get at the end of the day is to show where the STEM community writ large is strong and where we have capability to meet the requirements of this piece of legislation, right? So what we want to do is we want to echo back to the Congress. They have the right criterion for this grant program, and that, indirectly NSF should set up something that echoes exactly what Congress has said, not fold this into something else where they consider they're already covering these bases, if you will. And that's one of the things NSF has done in the past is they'll say, oh, we think we've already got a program that already meets these needs. We need to show that there's a need to fund additional grants for our community because we can meet the intent of Congress, up front, right? That's the intent of this RFI, is to show that we're capable as a community of meeting the criterion that are put out there for additional funding.
So much like what we did with that first town hall report that Jan referenced and that so many of you participated in, we'll be culling all of this together. And then what we have sort of sketched out is that we will begin some regular weekly office hours. They may even start before the end of the month. We will notify you to glean some more information about what it is that you have to offer. And, working on, understanding this research to practice trajectory that exists. So we're super excited about getting our arms around what you've got to share, what your initial ideas are. And keep in mind, you guys, this is just us looking at this ROI right now. It's not a formal process or anything else. So don't worry about, official citations or language, and, feel free to use abbreviations. We get it. And, don't kill yourselves spending, days and days and days completing this RFI. What we want right now is a snapshot. Correct, James?
That's right. No, we just want to get a sense of where we're strong in meeting the criteria that are out there. And that's, the RFI reproduces what's in the bill as criterion for funding.
Right, exactly. And feel free to reach out to us with questions as you complete this. And then we'll gear up those office hours as sort of general sessions where you can drop in, ask questions, kick around some ideas or thoughts with us or with others. And we'll get that scheduled soon. Jan just texted me that it should be a beach activity. You can tell where her mind is right now as she's driving to the Cape, and maybe she's right. It should be fun. This is really, honestly, a moment, for the ecosystems, for the hard work that all of you have done. And it's a brainstorm, and it's a vision, and it's fun. And we really are excited about engineering this process with you. Thank you all for enabling us to get to this really exciting position right now. It's not every day that your initiative gets, defined and singled out in a bill of this kind of federal bill of this kind of magnitude. So again, I just can't overstate our excitement about this and how thrilled we are. So thanks for asking me to talk about this.
Well, thank you so much, Alyssa. And I think a couple things to keep in mind. The first is what I learned today is I don't want to go on a beach vacation with Jan, because apparently this is what she does there. But the key is that you shouldn't overthink this at this stage. Just make sure to get those programs and ideas and concepts in so that we can start to piece it all together. The other thing to keep in mind that I think is really exciting is that we have a sort of rare opportunity, because of the way everything is structured and the timeline, to potentially help influence NSF's process for evaluating all of this work. So we're going to be looking to you for that as well. And the final thing is Jan keeps mentioning in text, and Alyssa mentioned as well, that we're really looking for an ROI sort of focus here. And that's why we had those conversations in the beginning. A big part, I think, and James, I'd love you to comment on this, a big part of this work and increasing our likelihood of success in these applications is not to be thinking about experimenting with brand new ideas. That's great. There's a place for it. We love it. But that's not this. This is about taking the things that we know works in certain regions and at certain scales and expanding it and scaling it and working together to take those solutions that the ecosystems have developed over the past 7 or 8 years and put them into practice in a much broader context. Is that a fair assumption? Because I really don't know what I'm talking about.
No, it is, Jeremy. I mean, the big turning point in the policy conversation about STEM education that this bill embodies is the notion that we want to scale up what we know is working, right? We don't want the National Science Foundation just to be investing in research and figuring out what's working. We want to set up a new apparatus, new centers across the country to help scale up what's working. So I think the name of the game here is to be able to demonstrate, and again, the criterion are right there in the RFI, and they're pulled right from the bill, what our capabilities are to address those specific aspects of scaling up proven practices in STEM. And,
well, thank you.
And can I say one other thing too? Jeremy made a really good point at the beginning of this conversation about, to some degree, this is about defining what an ecosystem is. And if you've got one impression from the way I talk about this, the thing that the folks on Capitol Hill, I think, understood that resonated with them about what a STEM ecosystem is there's this new category of locally based or maybe regionally based organizations that are devoted to the purpose of improving STEM education, right? They're not made of researchers. They're not made of teacher organizations. They have the specific purpose of improving STEM in their local communities. And that a really good goal of federal policy should be to support scaling up those efforts, right? That's the key concept I think we're trying to communicate to the rest of the world of just what a STEM ecosystem is. They don't all have one brand or one type of organization, and they're not all in higher education or K-12, but they're all organizations founded around the principle of improving STEM education. And the idea being that the federal government's going to start investing in those kind of organizations directly.
Well, James, thank you as always for all of the work that you do with us and for the young people in this country. It's all very exciting. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to share that RFI with ecosystem leaders, but make sure that you've got it handy. Get it to your organization. Start thinking about what those next steps are. Again, please respond by September 4th. Then we'll be taking next steps from there. Just a quick reminder, coming up next, we're hosting a brown bag SLECoP back to school learning series at noon Eastern time on September 8th, 15th, and the 22nd. These will be intense, quick, and focused conversations with experts on the topics of belonging, funding, and play as they relate to STEM education. The registration links for those are going into the chat right now, and they'll also be on the follow-up email from this session. the 30-minute conversations on September 8th, September 15th, September 22nd. These intimate and informative dialogues are designed to give you tools to get your school year off to a STEM-tastic start. Stay tuned for more notes that'll be forthcoming on this important series in September. Once again, thank you to all of the presenters from the first half of this hour who shared their work from the ecosystem in those convenings and engaged in those conversations. And then Jeremy and Martha for their work in making this happen and talking to us today. And as always, James Brown for his insights. We thank you all, and we're looking forward to working with you as we expand these efforts. We'll see you all next time.